Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. I am Jeremy Nettles, the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. Sometimes on this program I will go over sermons that I have delivered recently at River Ridge, and that is going to be the case today. This isn't one that I gave last week or the week before that. It's actually been a couple of months. But ever since I gave it, I thought, this would make a good TV program, and so that's what we're going to cover today. The title is Do It With Your Might. Now let me set this up for you. Occasionally, someone will discover a shared interest with you, right? And often when that happens, they'll end up asking, what's your favorite of whatever is this thing that we've just discovered interests us both? It might be our favorite song by a particular band. It might be a favorite dish in a particular cuisine. It might be a favorite place to stop and stay in a particular city. But there's a problem here. Depending on the extent of your interest, the question may not make a whole lot of sense. Maybe somebody asks you your favorite color. Well, that's no problem. Since I don't particularly care, it's easy for me to just say green. Green is my favorite color. By the same token, if you were to ask me, who is your favorite classical composer? That's pretty easy for me to answer. I'm not all that well versed in the classical composers. The only one that I really know very well at all is Beethoven. And that sort of makes him my favorite by default. Now, on the other hand, if you were to ask me, what's your favorite Led Zeppelin album? You might as well ask which of my children is my favorite. I appreciate and adore all of them. And they're not all the same, they're not interchangeable, and I appreciate different things about each one. And of course they're not all perfect, and I dislike different things about each one. But I love them all. And I have an obligation to love them all. And an obligation to not have a favorite. Among the Led Zeppelin albums, of course, is what I mean. Well, occasionally somebody will learn what my job is, and then they will ask me something like, what's your favorite Bible verse? I can't give a real answer to that, any more than if you asked me, which of your kids is your favorite? But because it's happened enough times, and I've searched for what I would call my favorite enough times, I have noticed that there's one passage in particular that I find myself thinking about more often and sharing with others, and that passage is the one that I want to discuss with you today. Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. Well, I told you the title of this video already, Do It With Your Might, and so you can see this is where we get our title in the first half of verse 10. Now, of course, when we address this passage and really anything in Ecclesiastes, we ought to begin with a couple of caveats. The first one is that Solomon's whole point here is that this physical world around us is all there is. And of course, that's not true. He didn't know any better in his circumstances. God hadn't revealed that to them yet. But he has revealed a lot more to us, and so that kind of cuts the bottom out of Solomon's point. And we ought to read it with that in mind. We should also mention about this passage that it's not always intended to be taken with the utmost of literalness. Let not oil be lacking on your head. This is not a command from God that you must anoint yourself daily. And then there's the term Sheol at the end of verse 10. That might be a bit of a surprise to you if you're not sure what to do with that. Sheol refers to the grave. It's synonymous in some sense with hell. And in some versions of the Bible, that's the way that this word will be translated. But that's Solomon's point. There is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom after death. And he says that's where we're all headed. And so we might as well do the best that we can with the time we have here. So as I said, his whole argument is missing the fact that there is more to reality than the physical world. But nevertheless, it's worth paying attention to his conclusion. And we're going to get a lot more out of it if we look at the whole book. So let's start with the organization. The way that this book is stitched together is a little bit sporadic. It's not exactly that it runs in circles, but it does kind of circle around itself. As it does, it's climbing. So it's kind of like it's climbing a spiral staircase. That's the way I imagine it anyway. And as he goes around in these circles, he's climbing higher and higher, and he's continuing throughout the entire course of the book to search for the meaning of life. He doesn't come right out and say that, but that's his goal. Throughout chapter 1, Solomon establishes that there is a problem, and that problem is vanity. He calls it vanity and striving after wind. So the idea there is an emptiness, a complete lack of the ability to grasp on and hold on to something and keep it with you. It's always trying to fly away. Everything is fleeting. And so he says in verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is going to continue, not just the theme of grasping at something that you cannot possibly take hold of, but the very phrases, striving after wind, and especially vanity, is going to occur over and over and over throughout this book. So having established that problem in chapter 1, he goes on to examine the problem and attempt to find solutions in chapters 2 through 8. And so he examines life through the lens of various pursuits. One of those pursuits is the pursuit of excess. It's basically vice. He gives in to all of the fleshly passions and desires and says, maybe this is where I will find lasting meaning and satisfaction. Later on, he gives the same treatment to wisdom, and he thinks maybe the meaning of life, maybe the whole point of it is to focus on learning and gaining not just knowledge, not just understanding, but wisdom. After that, he moves on and decides maybe I will find satisfaction in labor. And then he says maybe I'll find some lasting meaning in wealth and honor. Then he tries piety and finally duty. We could probably throw a few others in there, but those are the ones that stand out, at least in my mind. Let's go through them in order. Of excess, he says in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? It didn't work. It left him feeling empty in the end. That's the root word behind vanity, is emptiness. He moves on to wisdom, and we find in chapter 2, verse 15, he says, Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. Solomon is known as the wisest man alive. And he says that all of his wisdom is vanity. There's nothing to be gained by it. Why have I been so very wise? And what's his problem? What happens to the fool will happen to me also. What he means there is death. No matter how wise you become, you can't keep death from eventually catching up to you. He moves on to labor. And he says in chapter 2, verses 22 and 23, What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity. So he was searching for satisfaction, and he's finding that there is none in work. There's a little bit, but it doesn't last. He moves on to wealth. There are many people who have made the pursuit of wealth their primary goal in life, and Solomon is not an exception to this. He tried it, at least for a time. And let's read what he found out in verses 10 and 11 of chapter 5. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? You can probably identify with that to some extent. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. We always find another way to spend our wealth. we always find ourselves wanting more. Even if we love our riches, we're not satisfied with them. Vanity and striving after wind. He moves on to piety, and you would think, this being the Bible and all, that this would be the spot where he finds some lasting meaning. The spot where he says, finally, I found something that I can lay hold of and hold on to, and it's not fleeting. It sticks around. It's finally not striving after wind. In chapter 7, let's read verses 15 and 16. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Well, that's pretty jaded, isn't it? So he's looking for this lasting satisfaction, and what he finds is that righteousness does not guarantee satisfaction. And his conclusion from that is that you shouldn't bother to be too righteous. Now, there's a little bit more to that point. I don't want to come off completely misrepresenting him here, but just think of how cynical you have to be in order to say something like that. Okay, well, he moves away from righteousness and on to duty, which is similar, but it's not quite the same, is it? And in chapter 8, verses 5 through 7, he says, whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will follow the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be. For who can tell him how it will be? So he acknowledges the importance of duty, and he says you ought to do your duty, you ought to follow the king's command. There is a time and a way for everything. But even if you do your duty, that doesn't mean things are going to turn out well. He found nothing lasting, nothing satisfying in the long term, nothing that guaranteed success. He found no success that wasn't fleeting. And he found no way to change the grim fact that death comes for us all. Let's read verses 16 and 17 of chapter 8. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. The wisest man in the world has acknowledged defeat and said, we cannot know. And if you meet someone who claims to know, he's lying. He cannot find it out. So that's pretty depressing. And in chapters 9 through 12 of Ecclesiastes, Solomon gives his conclusion. And this functions as sort of a user's manual for life on this earth. In chapter 9, he discusses what he found and his crucial conclusion, and we've read some of that already. As he continues on into chapter 10 and 11 and 12, he gives a lot of additional recommendations, and he says, well, all of that being the case, you ought to maybe try to do this. There are a lot of proverbs here, things about wisdom and folly, and obviously wisdom being better and worth pursuing, even if it is vain and destined to fall away in the end. He talks about a lot of actions that we might take that end up hurting us. We see a lot of that in chapter 10. And so the admonition there is to at least avoid hamstringing our own efforts and hurting ourselves. He talks a lot about financial security, and he gives some pretty sage advice if we're willing to put in the time to pay attention to it. And finally, he talks a lot about devotion to God before it's too late. And that's how this book ends. It culminates in the last two verses of Ecclesiastes, which are very well known and very well loved. Let's read those, chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Well, that's a great place to end the book, but they're not actually the logical endpoint of the discussion in which Solomon was engaging throughout the course of the book. That came back in chapter 9. In chapter 12, he's offering his opinion. And it happens to be the right opinion, and certainly the Holy Spirit had something to do with bringing that about and having it written down here on these pages for us. But Solomon from a purely fleshly, physical perspective, hasn't actually supported that opinion with facts in the way that he supported his conclusions about life on this earth with facts. In relating all of those facts in chapters 1 through 8, and in all of his reasoning, he was trying to account for God's will, but at every step it was without actually knowing what are God's plans. And so he couldn't go very far. And he only considered what is true under the sun. And that is another phrase that occurs repeatedly throughout this book, under the sun. That's the scope of his inquiry. That's all that he is really considering, because that's all he can observe, and it's all that he knows. And Solomon's examination of life under the sun led him to chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white, let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. So having gone through all of that, his conclusion sounds pretty carefree. It sounds almost immoral. It's that you only live once approach toward life that says, grab hold and do whatever makes you happy, and who cares what the rest of the world thinks, let alone what God thinks. But it's really not carefree. It's really not immoral. Verse 7, for example, presupposes some adherence to God's instructions. Eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Now, he's not just saying that you can go and do whatever you want and God's going to approve of it. He's assuming that if you are behaving in the way that God has commanded, then eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart. And then he wraps it all together in verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. That is a huge expectation. He's saying, don't do things halfway. Don't settle for good enough. Okay, so that's a fine encouragement, a nice little life lesson from a guy 3,000 years ago who's saying, give some attention to detail and make sure that you do the best you can. Does it really matter to us? Okay, well, let me give you some examples here. In the context of the church, which is what I spend most of my time thinking about, this definitely does matter. In Romans chapter 12, let's read verses 4 through 8. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. So Paul here is using an analogy. The church is a body, he's saying, and the body is composed of all these different parts, and all those different parts of the body must do their intended function, and they must do it well. Without each one of those, where would the body be? So in God's kingdom, in the church, does it sound like good enough for government work is an adequate standard? Does it sound like God will be pleased if, in the church, we do something and maybe it's not quite up to what we would like it to be, and we just say, well, I can't see it from my house, and then move on? God can see it from his house, and he's not going to be happy. Paul makes basically the same point in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. He's even using the same analogy, and I think we should read verses 15 through 17 there. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? Well, look, you may not like being an ear, or you may not like being a nose. You may wish that you were something a little bit more presentable, something more admired, something more powerful. But, the body needs all 10 of its toes. The body needs 2 armpits. The body relies on less presentable members, and it fails to appreciate or fails to care for those less presentable members at its own peril. If you're a toe, be the best toe you can imagine. Help to provide balance. Work to be strong and reliable. Make sure that you're clean and pedicured in such a way that there's no need for the rest of the body to worry about an ingrown toenail or a fungal infection. And maybe I'm taking the metaphor a little bit too far here, but I hope you get the point. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Do it the best you can. Why? We saw Solomon's reasoning, and it was very fleshly. It was just, you got anything better to do? But there's also very important reasons from a spiritual perspective in the New Testament why we ought to do it with our might. In Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 22, Paul says, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." So there's two parts of this. In a sense, we are representatives of God for the rest of the world. And so Paul is speaking particularly to a bondservant who has a master who perhaps is not part of the church. And so he's saying, you need to serve this master as you would serve the Lord, partially because of the reflection that it will give on the church, but also because, you really are serving the Lord. Everything that you do is in service to God. Do we want people looking at Christians and saying, I don't want to hire that sort of person? It occurs to me that employers very well may start behaving that way, specifically because we are Christians in the relatively near future. That seems to be the direction that things are headed, but I hope I'm wrong. But even if that does turn out to be the case, it had better be on Christ's account and not on yours. Jesus said in Matthew 5:11, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." You're not blessed to have people saying bad things about you because you're responsible for bad things. You're blessed if they're saying bad things about you and it's false and it's because of Christ. We are His representatives in this world. We have an expression in our language. Actually, there's two of them. One of them is the Midas touch, which comes from an old Greek myth of King Midas, who was granted the ability to turn anything into gold, everything, as a matter of fact, into gold that he touched. You find in the course of the myth that turns out to not be so pleasant after all. But we tend to use it in a sense of good, that this person is able to turn anything to gold that they touch, right? We have a similar expression, a green thumb, which is more or less the same thing. The idea is that everything that this person plants grows. And there may be a few odd people out there who have that Midas touch or who have that green thumb without really trying. But I have not seen any evidence of it. In my experience, this effect comes partly from intelligence and education, but mostly it comes from perseverance. It comes from people who just won't quit, who will work hard, harder than everybody else, who will continue going when everybody says you should just give up, who are willing to see the project through and work for a good outcome. God is not interested in a bunch of spineless, worthless toadies content to live in their parents' basement and mooch off their neighbors and their families and the government and God Himself. He is our Father, and He is the best of all possible fathers. And so He's willing to deal with us in an understanding way. He's willing to extend forgiveness to us for our faults and our mistakes. He's willing to show us mercy. And He's willing to give us even things that we don't deserve, like salvation and a place to live in His home. But He also expects us to do something with all of the resources that He provides. So, if you are a husband or a wife, be the best husband or wife you can be. so that people would hold you up as an example to follow and say, that man is an excellent husband. That lady is an excellent wife. If you're a father, be the best father you can be. If you're a mother, be the best mother you can be. If you're a friend, be the best friend you can be. If you're an employee, be the best employee. If you're the boss, be the best boss around. If you're a homemaker, then make the best home you can. If you're a citizen, then be the best citizen you can be. Don't give up. Don't sit back and relax when it's good enough. Always strive to improve, to make your work better, to make your character better, to make better choices, to take better care of the people and things entrusted to you. If you're a child of God, don't be the kind of child that makes mom cry and makes dad go red in the face with frustration. Strive to please your Father in all that you do. That means paying attention to what He says and putting in not just a reasonable effort to do an acceptable job, but do the best you can. And then see what you could do better next time. None of this is going to earn our souls back. No matter how good you are at your job or at fixing your house's plumbing or at showing hospitality or contributing or encouraging or sharing the gospel, it will never be enough. But it matters more than Solomon could even realize when he gave us this advice all the way back in Ecclesiastes. Do you remember what his reason was? It amounted to, you only live once. You got something better to do with your time? Even that was a pretty good argument. But God hadn't yet revealed to him the extent of the plan. In reality, the grave is not the end. God came to earth as a man, and He did, with His might, everything His hand found to do in order to bridge the gap between us and Him. God sacrificed His only Son, the Lamb without blemish, in order to reconcile us to Him. Are you reconciled? If you're not, no amount of business success or social credit or expertise in a hobby means anything. It's the proper response to His mercy, but it can't earn His grace. The only way for anything you accomplish in this world to have any lasting significance is through its connection to God's plan for the salvation of man. Are you a part of that plan? Do you believe what He's told us? If you do, then obey Him. We'd love to be a part of your obedience, whether that's teaching you more of God's will or showing you opportunities to carry out God's work, or working side by side with you, or ideally all three. You can get in touch with us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org, and we'd be happy to help. Thank you for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.